On a cold January afternoon in 1919, the streets of Boston's North End trembled, not from an earthquake, but from a tidal wave of molasses. A massive storage tank, holding over 2 million gallons of thick, sticky syrup, suddenly burst. Within seconds, a brown wall, 25 feet high, raced through the city at 35 miles per hour, crushing buildings, sweeping away horses, and trapping people in a slow-moving nightmare. It sounds absurd, almost comical, but the death toll was real, and the devastation left scars that lasted decades. How did something so sweet turn so deadly? And what caused one of the strangest disasters in American history? In the early years of the 20th century, Boston's North End was a neighborhood where old traditions met the relentless march of modern industry. It was a place where the scent of fresh bread from Italian bakeries mingled with the brine of the nearby harbor, where narrow cobblestone streets wound their way through tenements that rose like crowded cliffs, each window alive with laundry lines, children's laughter, and the hum of immigrant life. The North End was not a wealthy neighborhood. It was, instead, a working-class quarter, home to Italians, Irish, and Eastern European Jews, who came to Boston chasing the same promise that had lured millions to America's shores: the hope of work, stability, and a chance to carve out something better for their families. By 1919, the neighborhood pulsed with an energy born of resilience. Families who had endured hunger, poverty, and hardship in the old world now lived in tight apartments, sharing walls and ceilings, with little privacy but a strong sense of community. Children played in streets already too narrow for modern automobiles, dodging horses and trolleys while vendors sold fruit, bread, and fresh fish from wooden carts. Life was noisy, crowded, and often difficult, but it was alive with color and spirit. The North End was more than a place to live. It was a mosaic of culture, survival, and the stubborn hope that one generation's struggle could become another's prosperity. But towering over this neighborhood of humanity and hardship stood the stark reminder of industrial progress: the giant molasses tank. Constructed in 1915 by the Purity Distilling Company, itself a subsidiary of the powerful United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the tank represented Boston's role in a global chain of commerce. Molasses was no simple sweetener here. It was a commodity tied to rum production, munitions manufacturing, and international trade. To the residents of the North End, the tank was less a marvel and more a menace. At 50 feet high and 90 feet across, it loomed like a fortress wall of riveted steel, filled and refilled with dark, viscous liquid imported from the Caribbean. Children often played around its base, their laughter echoing off its steel plates. Some even claimed they could sneak drops of molasses that leaked from the seams, dipping fingers into the sticky ooze as a forbidden treat. Adults were less charmed. They heard the tank groan in the night, its plates rattling as if under strain, and they saw the streaks of dark molasses that constantly seeped down its sides. Complaints were whispered to city officials, but in a time when industrial might was revered and corporations carried enormous influence, those voices were easily dismissed. Boston itself was at a crossroads in 1919. The city was still reeling from the losses of the First World War, its industries both enriched and destabilized by the demands of global conflict. The Spanish flu pandemic had only just ebbed, leaving grief-stricken households in its wake. Strikes and labor unrest rippled through the working class as wages lagged behind inflation. And yet, there was also a growing confidence in progress, the belief that engineering, science, and industry could reshape the world. Skyscrapers rose downtown, electricity spread to more homes, and the motor car began to replace the horse-drawn wagon. The molasses tank, with its vast capacity and gleaming presence, seemed a symbol of that modern age, an age of power, scale, and ambition. But for the North End residents, that ambition was felt less as progress and more as intrusion. The tank overshadowed their streets, looming above wooden homes and narrow alleys, casting long shadows, both literal and figurative. To them, the tank was not an icon of modernity, but a reminder that their neighborhood, dense with immigrants and poverty, was often seen by industry and government as a place to dump risks no one else wanted. It was a stage set for tragedy, though no one could yet imagine the scale of the disaster to come. The story of the Great Molasses Flood does not begin with the roar of steel and the rush of liquid, but with this neighborhood, with the lives lived in its shadows, and with a city learning to balance its thirst for progress against its duty to protect the vulnerable. Boston's North End, in 1919, was both vibrant and fragile, a place where the hopes of many converged, and where, all too soon, those hopes would be tested by forces beyond imagining. To modern sensibilities, molasses might appear as a humble byproduct, a thick, syrupy liquid lingering on the margins of kitchens and bakeries. Yet in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, molasses was nothing short of industrial gold. Its journey stretched across oceans, linking the Caribbean to North America, and its uses reached far beyond sweet confections. Molasses was the beating heart of an economic network tied to sugar plantations, colonial legacies, rum distilleries, and even munitions factories. By the time the giant tank was constructed in Boston, molasses was as much a weapon of war as it was a sweetener for bread. Molasses was born from sugar, the thick syrup that remained after raw sugar crystals had been extracted from cane. Caribbean plantations, worked for generations under brutal conditions of slavery and later indentured labor, had refined molasses production into a lucrative trade. Ships carried barrels of the substance northward, where distillers in New England turned it into rum, a drink that played a central role in both commerce and culture. Rum had helped fuel the triangular trade centuries before, binding together Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas in a web of exploitation and profit. By 1919, the human toll of those earlier systems lingered as shadows behind every barrel of molasses, though few in Boston paused to remember the history. What made molasses especially valuable in the years around the First World War was not just its role in food and drink, but its chemical potential. Through industrial processes, molasses could be fermented into alcohol that became the basis for munitions. Ethanol derived from molasses was used in the manufacture of explosives, including those desperately needed on European battlefields. The Purity Distilling Company, operating under the larger United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, was at the forefront of this transformation. Their vast Boston tank, built in 1915, was not merely about sweetening bread or candy. It was about feeding a war machine, stockpiling the raw material that could be converted into power and profit. The tank's presence in the North End was not coincidental. Boston was a hub of shipping and industry, its port facilities ideal for receiving cargoes from the Caribbean. Proximity to rail lines made it easy to transport molasses inland, and the dense immigrant neighborhood provided a workforce accustomed to hard labor. The choice of location revealed how industry often treated poor communities. They were convenient, expendable, and rarely given a voice in decisions that shaped their lives. The residents of the North End did not ask for the tank, yet it loomed above their homes because they lacked the political power to resist it. From an engineering perspective, the tank was ambitious but flawed. At 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, capable of holding 2.3 million gallons, it was one of the largest structures of its kind. Yet its steel walls were only half as thick as they should have been for such a load. Rivets were poorly fitted, seams leaked almost immediately, and those responsible for its design had little expertise in such massive containers. But molasses was in demand, and war was on the horizon. Speed, not safety, guided its construction. Residents soon grew accustomed to the sight of molasses trickling down the tank's sides, dark streaks that stained the metal. To the company, these leaks were nothing more than a nuisance. To the community, they were an omen. As World War I intensified, the pressure to produce industrial alcohol grew. Molasses shipments increased, and the tank was kept brimming almost constantly. For the USIA, each gallon represented profit, each shipment a step toward fulfilling lucrative government contracts. The war effort turned molasses into an unlikely symbol of modern industry, sticky, pungent, yet essential. Few industries were untouched by its reach. Bakers bought it for bread, brewers for beer, candy makers for sweets, distillers for rum, and factories for explosives. It was the dark fuel of an age in transition. By the war's end in 1918, the United States had emerged victorious but also transformed. Factories had expanded, corporations had grown wealthy, and the nation was beginning to sense its global power. Yet for Boston's North End, the end of the war brought not relief but continued risk. The tank still stood full, a reservoir of liquid profit, its steel plates straining silently under pressure. Industry had demanded speed, but now it demanded storage. And in the calculus of corporate efficiency, the safety of immigrant families was a small cost compared to the value of molasses as both commodity and weapon. Thus, by the dawn of 1919, the Great Tank in Boston's North End was more than just a container. It was a symbol of industrial ambition, wartime necessity, and corporate negligence. The story of the flood was already written in steel seams and sticky leaks, waiting only for the moment when physics would overpower profit and sweet ambition would collapse into bitter disaster. In the summer of 1915, at the height of mounting wartime demand, the Purity Distilling Company made a decision that would seal Boston's fate. The company, controlled by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, required an enormous storage facility to house incoming shipments of molasses from the Caribbean before they were processed into industrial alcohol. The chosen site, Boston's North End waterfront, a neighborhood crowded with Italian immigrants, dock workers, and their families. It was an ideal location for business, close to the harbor, rail lines, and the factories that would transform syrup into alcohol. For residents, it was an imposition, a looming mass forced upon them without consultation. For the company, it was a triumph of efficiency. The tank they envisioned would be colossal, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, with a storage capacity of 2.3 million gallons. It was among the largest tanks of its kind ever attempted in the United States. Yet for all its size, it was a structure born of haste and greed rather than sound engineering. Its steel plates were too thin for the immense pressure they would endure. The rivets, essential to holding those plates together, were of substandard quality and prone to leaking. The project was overseen not by trained engineers, but by company managers eager to save time and cut costs. Warnings emerged almost immediately. Workers who helped build the tank heard unsettling groans as it was filled. Residents of the North End soon grew used to the eerie sound of metallic pops and shutters echoing from the towering structure. Molasses seeped through its seams and dripped down the sides in sticky brown rivulets, a constant reminder of its imperfections. Children were drawn to these leaks, rushing to collect the syrup in cups as though it were a gift from the sky. To adults, however, it was a sign of negligence so blatant it bordered on criminal. In one early test, when the tank was first filled with water to check for leaks, it failed spectacularly. Water poured through the seams. Instead of reinforcing the structure, USIA dismissed the problem and filled the tank with molasses anyway, reasoning that the thicker liquid would be less likely to escape. The decision revealed the company's mindset. Short-term expediency outweighed long-term safety. After all, the tank was insured. Repairs were expensive, and molasses was money. The sheer volume of molasses stored within the tank created pressures few fully appreciated. At the bottom, the weight reached nearly 160 pounds per square inch, pressing relentlessly against the flawed steel walls. Each additional shipment raised the strain, yet no proper inspections were ordered. State officials, complicit through either neglect or corruption, looked the other way. Regulations for industrial storage were weak, and enforcement weaker still. The era belonged to corporations, and the voices of immigrant families counted for little in the calculations of Boston's industrial elite. Still, signs of trouble mounted. In 1918, with the war ending, the tank remained constantly full, sometimes overflowing. Neighbors complained of the groans, of the sticky residue that stained their homes, of the odor that seeped into daily life. Yet their concerns were dismissed. One manager famously reassured a resident who warned of catastrophe. "The tank is safe. You have nothing to worry about." His words, meant to soothe, were nothing more than a mask for negligence. In hindsight, the tank was less a structure than a time bomb. Every rivet was a weak point, every shutter a warning. The steel was brittle, especially in cold temperatures, and engineers later testified that its composition was flawed from the start. It lacked sufficient manganese, making it prone to cracking under stress. Had proper metallurgical analysis been done, the danger would have been obvious. But analysis takes time, and time was money. The tank became a fixture in the North End skyline, a hulking presence that cast shadows over homes and streets. To some, it was an eyesore; to others, a curiosity. To the company, it was profit made visible, a monument to industrial ambition. Yet hidden within its riveted shell was the inevitability of disaster. The leaks, the groans, the sticky stains, these were not anomalies. They were warnings unheeded, signs ignored in the name of expediency. By the winter of 1919, the stage was set. The tank was filled nearly to capacity with molasses freshly unloaded from Caribbean ships. Its steel plates, brittle in the cold January air, strained against the weight. Workers still heard the ominous groans. Neighbors still smelled the sickly sweetness in the air. Yet daily life continued beneath the looming shadow, as though the community had resigned itself to coexist with danger. The story of the Great Molasses Flood is not merely about a tank bursting. It is about the decisions that led to its creation, the shortcuts taken, the warnings ignored, and the arrogance of those who believed profit outweighed consequence. The tank was not simply flawed, it was doomed. And all who lived in its shadow, though unaware, were already caught in the trajectory of its collapse. In the years leading up to 1919, Boston's North End was a neighborhood defined by contrasts. On one hand, it was a place of hardship, overcrowded tenements where families of Italian, Irish, and Portuguese immigrants struggled to build new lives in the shadow of poverty and prejudice. On the other, it was a place of vibrant community, where the aroma of fresh bread, roasted chestnuts, and tomato sauce spilled from kitchens, where children darted between cobblestones playing games, and where neighbors leaned from windows to share gossip in the cadence of their native tongues. The people of the North End were resilient, their lives bound together by shared sacrifice and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. But always above them, looming like a silent overseer, was the molasses tank. It rose 50 feet into the sky, an unnatural monument in the midst of red brick houses, churches, and shops. Its dull steel sides bore the stains of leaking syrup, its riveted seams seeping with sweet residue that hardened in the sun and turned slippery in the rain. The children of the neighborhood found delight in it, sneaking over with cups and pails to collect the dripping molasses. For them, the tank was a kind of enchanted fountain, a free gift in a world where sweets were a rare luxury. They licked their sticky fingers and laughed, blind to the danger. The adults, however, were less enchanted. Housewives grumbled as molasses streaked their laundry, staining white sheets hung out to dry. Shopkeepers muttered as flies swarmed, drawn by the sugary scent that never seemed to leave the air. Dockworkers, accustomed to the rhythms of heavy industry, shook their heads at the ominous groans that came from the tank's bowels whenever shipments arrived, and it filled anew. The sound was unsettling, like the moan of a wounded beast too large to comprehend. But grumbling went no further, for what power did poor immigrants have against a corporation backed by wealth and political influence? Complaints went unanswered, voices silenced by indifference. Still, the tank became part of daily life, woven into the routine of the neighborhood. Families adjusted, as humans always do, learning to live with what they could not change. The tank cast shadows on afternoon markets, its sheer size disorienting against the scale of the narrow streets. In the evenings, as church bells tolled from St. Leonard's and children were called home, the steel giant glowed dimly under gas lamps, its dark silhouette rising above roofs like a fortress of commerce. There was, in truth, a kind of resigned intimacy between the residents and their unwelcome neighbor. They joked about its leaks, called it the giant molasses jug, and sometimes wagered on how much syrup would drip after a fresh shipment. Some shrugged off the groans as the natural song of industry, like the whistle of trains or the clang of factory bells. Yet even as the tank became normalized, it remained alien, an intrusion into the rhythm of the neighborhood, a reminder that the lives of ordinary people were at the mercy of decisions made in boardrooms far removed from the cobbled alleys of the North End. For the children born beneath its shadow, the tank was simply a fact of existence. They traced their games around it, chased one another beneath its dripping seams, and carried the smell of molasses home with them, clinging to their clothes and hair. They could not remember a time before it, and so they did not imagine a time after it. The tank was as permanent as the harbor, as eternal as the steeples that pierced the Boston skyline. The irony of history is that danger often disguises itself as routine. For the people of the North End, the tank was no longer an anomaly, but a background hum in the symphony of their lives. They lived, worked, prayed, and dreamed in its presence, never suspecting that it would one day explode into their world with catastrophic violence. And so life continued. Housewives scrubbed floors while the scent of molasses hung heavy in the air. Dockworkers hauled cargo past the groaning structure. Children scooped sticky syrup from the seams and giggled in delight. Priests walked by on their way to Vespers. Businessmen hurried past to catch the streetcars. And in every case, the tank loomed quietly over them, its steel belly swelling with pressure. By January 1919, with winter's chill pressing into every drafty tenement, the tank was filled nearly to its limit. Inside, the dark liquid pressed harder and harder against brittle steel plates, each groan of metal a warning ignored. Life in the shadow of the tank had become routine. But routine, in this case, was nothing more than the calm before the storm. The dawn of January 15th, 1919 broke cold but unseasonably mild for Boston in midwinter. The North End, usually buried in frost and bitter winds, was instead wrapped in a strange warmth, the air damp and heavy as though spring had arrived too early. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently against thawing cobblestones, their breath rising in gentle steam, while the harbor carried a faint mist that blurred the outlines of ships. Few paid heed to the weather beyond idle comments. To most, it was simply another day in a city that never paused. In the North End, the streets stirred to life with their familiar cadence. Housewives beat rugs against stoops, their arms moving in practiced rhythm. Shopkeepers lifted shutters and set out baskets of bread, fruit, and salted fish. Children, freed briefly from the chill of winter, darted into alleys for play before school. Dockworkers trudged toward the waterfront, their voices gruff but steady, while the distant hum of trolleys marked the awakening of Boston's larger rhythm. For those living in the shadow of the molasses tank, the day began like countless others before it. The giant, looming structure stood silently at the edge of Commercial Street, glistening faintly with condensation, its riveted sides streaked with dark residue. Inside, however, the story was different. The tank was filled to near bursting, swollen with over 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The unusual warmth of January had softened the viscous liquid, making it thinner, more restless, more alive. Pressure built quietly against steel plates already weakened by poor design and rushed construction. Workers nearby heard the familiar groans and pops echoing from the tank's belly, but these were dismissed as nothing unusual. After all, the structure had creaked and moaned since the day it was built. It had leaked consistently, its seams dripping sticky streams that hardened in the sun, yet it had always held. Why should today be different? At the Purity Distilling Company offices, a clerk sorted papers, noting shipments and tallies. Horses pulling delivery wagons clopped past the tank, their drivers oblivious to the strain building just feet away. The ground-level office of the North End Paving Division, nestled nearby, bustled as men prepared for another day of labor. Children played tag in the shadow of the looming cylinder, their laughter echoing against its curved steel walls. Housewives, ever pragmatic, hung laundry nearby, grumbling about the sugary scent that clung to clothes. The tank itself radiated unease. Some dockworkers later recalled that the groans were louder that morning, the sounds sharper, more urgent. They would speak of how the steel seemed to shudder, as though straining under a hidden weight. Yet those signs passed into the background noise of urban life. After all, who among the poor and working class dared to imagine that such a monument to industry might collapse? To do so would have meant believing that those in power, engineers, owners, city officials, had been careless, even reckless. Easier to assume the noises were harmless, the leaks a mere annoyance. Easier to trust, even reluctantly, in the permanence of the tank. As the morning unfolded, Boston itself pulsed with larger concerns. Prohibition loomed on the national horizon, casting uncertainty on the molasses industry. Political debates filled newspapers, while in homes, the talk was of rent, food prices, and the struggles of everyday survival. Few could afford to waste worry on a steel tank, no matter how odd its behavior. The world moved on, blind to the quiet disaster forming within its belly. By noon, the streets were crowded. Horses pulled wagons loaded with goods. Men hauled crates. Women carried baskets from markets, scarves drawn against the damp air. A policeman directed traffic at the busy crossing nearby, unaware that the tank behind him was swelling with imminent fury. Children paused in their play, staring up at the riveted seams that oozed sweet syrup. Their fingers sticky, they carried home bits of molasses as treats, the laughter of innocence ringing across the cobblestones. It was a neighborhood alive, unaware that its heartbeat would soon falter. The morning passed in routine, the people of the North End wrapped in the familiar texture of their lives. And yet, within that massive steel belly, the pressure mounted, each minute drawing closer to rupture. The tank stood silently over Commercial Street like a predator waiting to strike, its creaks the whispers of warning that no one heeded. At 12:40 p.m., the waiting would end. But for those in the hours before, life was still ordinary. Work, play, bread, laundry, laughter. No one realized that the day would not end as it began. At 12:40 p.m. on January 15, 1919, the ordinary rhythm of Boston's North End was shattered. What began as a low, metallic groan swelled in seconds into something monstrous, a deep, resonant roar that echoed like the roll of thunder trapped inside a drum. Then came the crack, sharp and violent, like gunfire splitting the air. The massive steel tank, swollen beyond endurance, surrendered to the relentless pressure within. Rivets tore loose with the sound of snapping bones, and the enormous structure split apart as if it had been no stronger than paper. In an instant, 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst forth with explosive force. Witnesses later said the ground shook as though an earthquake had struck, and the air itself trembled with the concussion. The great brown wave erupted outward, 15 feet high at its crest, moving with terrifying speed. Estimates placed it at 35 miles per hour, faster than a horse at full gallop. For a substance so often described as slow as molasses, its fury was inconceivable. The first casualties were horses pulling wagons nearby. They vanished beneath the wave, crushed or suffocated before their drivers even had time to scream. Wooden buildings lining Commercial Street splintered like matchsticks. A small shack housing the employees of the North End Paving Division was swept away, its occupants swallowed whole. The force of the wave hurled debris, timbers, barrels, carts, shards of glass, through the air like missiles, each coated in sticky, suffocating syrup. The firehouse closest to the tank, Engine Company 31, took the brunt of the surge. Its sturdy brick walls were no match for the flood. The building lifted from its foundation and collapsed, trapping firefighters beneath a crushing cascade of bricks and molasses. Rescuers would later find men pinned alive, their cries muffled, struggling not only against rubble but against the relentless grip of the syrup that clung to their bodies and pulled them down like quicksand. Children who had been playing nearby were overtaken in an instant. Some were swept blocks away, their small bodies tangled in the wreckage. Families who had gathered for lunch in their tenements suddenly found their kitchens and parlors invaded by a tide that crashed through windows and doors, turning domestic spaces into death traps. Walls groaned, floors buckled, staircases collapsed. The molasses was not only heavy, it was merciless, pushing with hundreds of pounds of pressure, smashing everything in its path. Eyewitnesses spoke of an otherworldly scene. Men and women stumbled, their feet trapped as if cemented, their arms thrashing as they tried to tear free from the sticky grip. Some sank, suffocated, unable to raise their heads above the thick, cloying sea. Horses screamed as they drowned. Dogs barked frantically before being silenced. The flood carried with it a sickly sweet smell, so overpowering that survivors later claimed they could never again taste molasses without recalling the horror. The police officer directing traffic at the nearby crossing was knocked off his feet, swept beneath a tide that carried him half a block before he managed to grab onto a lamppost. Others were not so lucky. Dock workers were hurled into the harbor, their bodies striking pilings as the flood surged over the wharf. Entire sections of the waterfront buckled under the assault, and the great tide spread outward, filling every low-lying space it encountered. Silence never came after the burst, only chaos. Screams pierced the air, mingling with the guttural roar of the molasses wave as it surged and receded, sloshing with terrible force between buildings. For those caught in the open, there was little chance of escape. The flood came too quickly, too violently. Even those who saw it in time found themselves running in vain. The wave overtook them, wrapping around their legs, dragging them down. To breathe meant inhaling syrup, thick and suffocating. To move meant fighting against a substance that clung and pulled with monstrous persistence. The tank itself had disintegrated into jagged shards of steel, flung outward with the violence of shrapnel. Some plates were hurled hundreds of feet, slicing through the air with lethal precision. One piece embedded itself into the ground like the blade of a giant axe. Others tore through walls and roofs, adding yet more destruction to the chaos. By the time the first surge ebbed, Commercial Street was unrecognizable. Where moments before stood houses, shops, stables, and offices, now stretched a landscape of ruin coated in a dark, glistening sheen. Bodies lay trapped, some still alive and calling out, others already stilled. Horses, once the heartbeat of the neighborhood's labor, lay half-submerged, their glazed eyes staring sightlessly. Cries for help rose above the sticky silence, desperate, muffled, pleading. The Great Molasses Flood had arrived in less than 5 minutes. But in those minutes, it had transformed Boston's North End into something out of nightmare. A battlefield without fire or smoke. Only sweetness turned to suffocation. The moment of rupture was over, but the disaster had only begun. The first cries for help rose above the sticky silence, even as the molasses tide still surged between buildings. Boston's North End, a district used to the noise of ships and street vendors, was now filled with screams of terror, groans of the injured, and the frantic shouts of those who had survived. Yet to rush toward the chaos was to face a landscape that defied belief. A city street turned swamp, where every step was a battle and every movement was weighed down by a suffocating sweetness. The Boston Police Department was the first organized force to respond. Officers from the nearby station house had been knocked off their feet when the wave struck, but those who survived quickly regrouped. They scrambled to aid the injured, wading into molasses that reached their knees, then their waists. They found themselves pulling at debris with sticky hands, trying to free men, women, and children pinned beneath collapsed timbers. Some officers later admitted that their revolvers and belts became so coated in syrup they were useless, weighing them down as they fought to move. Firefighters of Engine Company 31, whose own house had been destroyed, became both victims and rescuers. Trapped beneath rubble, some cried out as their comrades struggled to reach them, clawing through a mixture of bricks and molasses that threatened to set like glue in the winter air. Other fire companies, rushing from neighboring districts, arrived with ladders and axes, but quickly found their equipment failing. Hoses clogged, boots were sucked from their feet, and fire wagons could not penetrate streets choked with syrup. The horses that pulled them had to be cut free, many already flailing in the sticky muck. Word spread rapidly through Boston. Within minutes, sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket rushed ashore to lend their strength. Accustomed to the rigors of ship life, they threw themselves into the rescue with ropes and planks, hauling survivors from second-story windows where families were trapped. Some survivors clung desperately to window sills, too afraid to drop into the molasses sea below. The sailors lifted them one by one, their uniforms soon stained and heavy with the same substance that threatened to drag the civilians down. Doctors and nurses from the nearby Red Cross station also arrived, their white coats quickly turning brown as they waded into the mire. Makeshift triage stations were established on relatively dry patches of ground. Injuries were grim. Fractured skulls from flying debris, broken limbs from collapsing structures, and the silent, terrible faces of those suffocated by molasses inhaled into their lungs. The rescuers could do little but scrape the syrup from mouths and noses, praying it was not too late. For those pinned, time was the greatest enemy. The molasses, warm when it first burst free, cooled rapidly in the winter air. Within minutes it thickened, hardening around victims until it was like cement. Men swung axes to cut through beams, but often they also had to chop through hardened molasses that held survivors fast. Some people begged rescuers to cut off their shoes, belts, or even limbs if it meant freedom from the syrup that imprisoned them. One of the most desperate efforts took place at Engine Company 31. Firefighters heard the muffled cries of their brothers beneath the ruins of the collapsed station. They dug furiously, but the more they cleared, the more molasses poured into the cavity. At one point, rescuers used saws to cut through timbers while others scooped molasses with buckets, trying to create pockets of air for those trapped inside. Some men were pulled free, coughing and barely conscious, while others could not be saved in time. As hours passed, the rescue became a citywide effort. Police, fire, sailors, and civilians all labored together. Ropes were tied to bodies submerged in molasses so groups could pull in unison, each heave a battle against the glue-like grip. Some rescuers formed human chains, passing children hand to hand from the syrup to safety. Others risked their own lives, diving into the thick waves to search for the missing, emerging gasping and smeared with molasses from head to toe. Eyewitnesses described the rescue as surreal, a nightmare in daylight. Rescuers were nearly indistinguishable from victims, their faces and clothing covered in sticky brown layers, their eyes red from the fumes. At times, it seemed the molasses itself was fighting back, pulling both rescuer and victim down into its depths. Yet the work did not stop. Every scream, every faint cry beneath the debris drove the men and women on. By nightfall, hundreds of rescuers had converged on the north end. Torches and lanterns were lit, their flames reflecting off the glistening brown sheen that coated the ruined streets. The floodwaters had subsided, but the destruction remained, a frozen sea of molasses holding within it both the dead and the living. Dogs barked frantically as they scented trapped survivors. Families wept openly, begging rescuers to keep digging, to keep searching. The first hours after the rupture had been chaos, but now Boston was facing a grim reality. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a momentary disaster. It was a catastrophe that would demand days, even weeks, of relentless rescue and recovery. And yet, in those first desperate hours, amid the screams, the sticky grip, and the overwhelming smell of molasses, there was also something else, an unbreakable human will, the refusal to abandon those still alive beneath the ruin. As darkness descended on Boston's North End, the disaster took on a new and more haunting character. The flood had struck in the brilliance of daylight, its violence captured by witnesses whose eyes could scarcely believe what they saw. But the night brought shadows, uncertainty, and an eerie stillness broken only by the muffled cries of the trapped and the ceaseless work of rescuers. Torches, lanterns, and hastily rigged floodlights threw long streaks of light across the syrup-coated streets, their flickering beams reflected back in dull brown glimmers from the hardened surface. What had been a bustling neighborhood mere hours before now resembled an alien landscape. A glistening field of ruin where houses slumped like broken toys and streets lay buried beneath a congealed tide. The rescuers, exhausted yet unwilling to stop, pressed on. Firefighters cut through beams and planks, their axes sticking as molasses clung to every swing. Police officers pulled ropes tied to half-submerged bodies, groaning under the weight. Sailors brought their maritime skills to bear, lashing together makeshift bridges and platforms so workers could move across the sticky surface without sinking. The Red Cross volunteers, doctors, nurses, and even ordinary citizens transformed corners of surviving buildings into aid stations, where the injured lay on beds slick with syrup, waiting for treatment that came as swiftly as possible. For the trapped, the night was unbearable. As the molasses cooled further, it thickened, turning pliable syrup into a near-solid prison. Survivors who had managed to keep their heads above the wave during the day now found themselves immobilized, their strength waning with every hour. The cries of children echoed in the darkness, haunting the rescuers. Some could be saved, pulled out with brute force, stripped of clothing and skin rubbed raw by the sticky grip. Others, too deeply pinned beneath wreckage, could only be comforted as they slipped away. The work was slow, agonizingly so. Every step across the molasses sucked at boots, sometimes trapping them entirely. Some rescuers cut their shoes away rather than waste precious minutes trying to free them. Men resorted to crawling on boards laid across the ground, distributing their weight to avoid sinking. Horses that had once pulled fire wagons and carts struggled desperately when led into the district. Many collapsed, unable to rise again, and had to be put down. The sight broke even hardened policemen, who wept openly in the torchlight. Through the night, more volunteers arrived. Students, laborers, off-duty sailors, and neighbors brought buckets, ropes, and shovels. They dug with bare hands when tools failed, scooping molasses in desperate handfuls. At times, silence would fall across the wreckage as rescuers halted their noisy work to listen for faint sounds. Breathing, knocking, or a cry for help beneath the ruins. When a voice was heard, all efforts converged, dozens working together to carve a tunnel through debris before the air gave out. Sometimes they succeeded, dragging a survivor into the cold night air. Sometimes they did not. The sensory burden was overwhelming. The air stank with a sickly sweetness that clung to throats and noses, making breathing laborious. The sticky residue coated rescuers' faces, hair, and clothes until they were unrecognizable. Lantern flames sputtered as they drew oxygen from a molasses-saturated air heavy with fumes. Every breath was a reminder that the flood was not water. It was a substance that coated and suffocated, resisting every human effort to move through it. As midnight passed, the balance of hope began to shift. In the first hours, the mission had been rescue. Now, more often than not, it was recovery. The bodies found were twisted and encased in syrup, their features sometimes unrecognizable. Families, desperate to know the fate of loved ones, pleaded with rescuers for news. Some waited at the edge of the ruined district, unwilling to leave even as the hours stretched into dawn. Grief, raw and public, spilled into the streets as names of the dead began to circulate. Yet amid the despair, there were moments of triumph. A young boy, thought lost, was pulled alive from beneath a pile of wreckage nearly 8 hours after the wave struck, his small body coated in molasses, but his lungs still drawing breath. His rescue ignited cheers that echoed across the sticky ruins, a reminder that even in the darkest night, life could still be found. These victories renewed the rescuers' determination, even as fatigue numbed their limbs and the cold January air gnawed at their resolve. By dawn, the north end was unrecognizable. The once bustling commercial street had become a graveyard of buildings, wagons, and shattered timbers, all cemented together in a hardened crust of molasses. The work had only begun. The day ahead would bring more digging, more grim discoveries, and a realization that Boston's nightmare was far from over. The flood had lasted only minutes, but its consequences would stretch into weeks, months, and years. For those who labored through that first night, however, one memory remained etched forever. The sight of an American city transformed by a tide of sweetness into a field of death, and the knowledge that they had fought with every ounce of strength against something both absurd and terrible. The Great Molasses Flood had turned familiar streets into a battlefield, and its first night was a testament to the courage and the heartbreak of those who dared to wade into the sticky abyss. When the gray light of dawn broke over Boston on January 16, 1919, it revealed a neighborhood forever altered. The chaotic energy of the first day, with its frantic search for survivors, slowly gave way to the grim recognition that many who remained trapped beneath the debris were no longer alive. The Great Molasses Flood had transformed from a rescue mission into a recovery operation, and with that shift came a new set of burdens, both physical and emotional, for the city's inhabitants. The streets of the North End were no longer a familiar urban grid but a hardened wasteland. The molasses, which the previous day had flowed like a tidal wave, now clung stubbornly in thick slabs that encased wreckage and bodies alike. Wooden boards, iron beams, horse-drawn wagons, and furniture were welded together in a grotesque sculpture of disaster. Workers who had clawed through the sticky mass in desperation now faced the monumental task of dismantling and clearing it. Teams of firefighters, police, soldiers, and volunteers organized themselves with more method than before. The military brought in equipment to aid the effort: pumps, shovels, and wagons. The fire department deployed high-pressure saltwater hoses from the harbor, spraying the hardened syrup in an effort to break it down and wash it away. But the cold January air conspired against them. Water froze into icy sheets across sidewalks, making footing treacherous, while the molasses, thickened by the frost, clung more tightly than ever. Rescue dogs were brought in to sniff for survivors, but they found themselves hampered by the overpowering sweetness that coated everything. Their paws stuck in the hardened goo, their noses confused by the overwhelming scent. Horses, essential to the labor of hauling debris, fared no better. Many were immobilized or exhausted after only a few steps. In response, the cleanup crews began laying down planks and boards, creating pathways across the district so that men and animals alike could move more freely. For families searching for loved ones, the second day was one of dread. They stood by the cordoned streets, some clutching photographs, others repeating names and desperate pleas to officials. The work of removing bodies was carried out with care, but also with efficiency. Each discovery was somberly recorded, the dead placed on stretchers and carried to makeshift morgues. The molasses clung to them, turning recovery into an almost ceremonial act, as if each body had been embalmed by the disaster itself. The psychological toll was immense. Rescuers who had worked tirelessly the previous night now confronted the reality of death on a mass scale. They were no longer digging toward the possibility of a living voice, but pulling from the ruins the silent forms of neighbors, co-workers, and friends. Reports noted men breaking down as they carried children's bodies, their tears mingling with molasses. Nurses who had rushed to treat injuries now shifted their focus to consoling grieving families. Boston was a city in mourning, and the molasses, once a symbol of industry and prosperity, had become a substance of horror. The city government moved swiftly to re-establish order. Police patrolled the perimeter of the ruined district to keep onlookers at bay and to prevent looting, though there was little to steal from the destroyed homes and shops. Politicians and city officials toured the site, their shoes sticking with each step, their expressions grave. Reporters gathered at the edges, scribbling notes and sketching illustrations that would soon spread the story across the nation. The disaster was already being framed as something both tragic and bizarre, a calamity of such odd character that it drew incredulity as well as sympathy. Meanwhile, the molasses itself posed a new threat. With every passing hour, it hardened further, locking debris into place, but also creating sharp edges and jagged surfaces where beams and metal were half embedded. Fires occasionally flared when lanterns or sparks from tools came into contact with fumes, though crews rushed to contain them. The sticky substance also seeped into basements, cellars, and sewers, creating blockages that would take weeks to clear. Some feared disease might spread in the stagnant, sweet muck, though the cold winter air mitigated the immediate risk. Relief efforts expanded beyond the North End. Churches organized food drives, offering hot meals to displaced families. Temporary shelters were arranged in schools and community halls for those whose homes had been destroyed. The Red Cross coordinated volunteers, sending nurses and clerks to aid both the injured and the bereaved. Across Boston, donations began pouring in, clothing, bedding, and money to help the victims. In the midst of chaos, the city's communal spirit emerged, binding together rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, in a shared determination to recover. By the end of the second day, the district was a battlefield transformed into a worksite. Giant pumps sucked molasses mixed with seawater back into the harbor, staining its waters brown. Shovels clanged against hardened syrup. Wagons creaked under the weight of debris pulled free from the sticky mire. And still, beneath it all, there remained the possibility of finding another victim. For every piece of wreckage cleared, a family somewhere waited for news, hope fading, grief mounting. The Great Molasses Flood was no longer merely a strange catastrophe. It had become a civic trauma, a wound carried not just by those who lived in the North End, but by Boston as a whole. Yet amid the sorrow and the ruin, there was a dawning realization. This was not simply an accident of fate. The tank had burst for a reason. Whispers grew louder. Questions of responsibility, negligence, and profit weighed against human life. But for now, recovery came first. Answers and justice would have to wait. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, grief and recovery occupied the city's mind. But as the days stretched into weeks, sorrow inevitably gave way to anger. The people of Boston began asking the questions that hung heavily over every sticky street and broken home. How could this have happened? Why had a massive tank of molasses been allowed to stand in the midst of a crowded neighborhood? Who was responsible for the death, destruction, and misery left in its wake? The giant tank at 529 Commercial Street, once looming as an industrial monument, now existed in memory as a symbol of neglect. It had belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, a powerful firm with national reach. For years, residents had grumbled about the tank. They had noticed the dark stains that seeped down its sides, evidence of leaks. Children had dipped sticks into the ooze for a sweet taste, laughing at the idea that such a behemoth could ever burst. Men working in nearby buildings joked uneasily that the tank creaked and groaned on hot days, its iron plates straining against the syrupy tide inside. These warnings had gone unheeded. As newspapers dug deeper, the stories grew damning. It emerged that the tank had been hastily constructed in 1915 during the fervor of World War I. Molasses was no simple sweetener. It was a vital commodity, used in the production of industrial alcohol that could be turned into munitions, explosives, and fuel. The demand was urgent, the profits immense, and the time for careful engineering short. The tank had been built quickly, without the rigorous testing that such a structure required. Rumors swirled that it had never even been properly pressure tested with water, a standard procedure that might have revealed its weaknesses before disaster struck. The company, for its part, immediately sought to distance itself from blame. Executives argued that the disaster was the result of sabotage, pointing to anarchists and labor agitators who had recently plagued Boston with strikes and unrest. This was, after all, the era of the Red Scare, when fears of radicals and revolution haunted American cities. To USIA, the idea of deliberate destruction seemed plausible and politically convenient. It shifted suspicion away from negligence and onto shadowy enemies. But the theory faltered under scrutiny. No evidence of explosives, tampering, or political malice was ever found. Engineers and inspectors turned their eyes to the structure itself. They noted the thinness of the steel plates, some barely 7/16 of an inch thick. Rivets that held the plates together had sheared off during the collapse, suggesting they had been poorly made or improperly installed. The tank had groaned for years under its load, and residents' complaints had been ignored. One engineer bluntly declared that the tank had been too thin, too high, and too hurried. Boston's newspapers fanned public outrage. Editorials thundered against corporate greed and negligence, pointing out that lives had been sacrificed for speed and profit. Cartoons mocked the company's flimsy explanations, while reporters chronicled the daily struggles of survivors who faced homelessness, injury, or bereavement. What had at first seemed like a bizarre act of nature now stood revealed as the consequence of human error and, perhaps, human indifference. The survivors themselves lent weight to the anger. Families testified about the sound of rivets popping, about the sticky leaks they had seen long before the flood. Workers who had raised concerns about the tank's safety came forward, though often too late to have saved those lost. Their voices carried not only grief but also indignation, for they had been ignored. The city, sensing the fury of its citizens, began formal proceedings. Lawsuits were filed against USIA, demanding compensation for the dead, the injured, and the ruined. What followed would become one of the most extensive legal battles of its time, a class action lawsuit that would stretch on for years and test the limits of corporate accountability in America. For the families of victims, justice seemed both distant and uncertain. But for Boston as a whole, the very act of seeking it offered a sense of direction, a way to channel grief into purpose. As investigations pressed on, another layer of the story emerged. The flood was not merely about engineering flaws or corporate negligence, but also about the broader question of industrialization itself. The United States, at the dawn of the 20th century, had embraced progress with unshakable zeal. Factories rose where tenements stood, and massive storage tanks sprouted near neighborhoods. Efficiency, output, and profit were celebrated, while the voices of working-class residents were often silenced. The Great Molasses Flood had exposed the cost of such priorities in the most visceral way. The public wanted accountability, and in their quest for it, they began to recognize the broader stakes. This was not simply about one tank in Boston. It was about the balance between industrial ambition and human safety, between corporate power and civic responsibility. The Great Molasses Flood, in its strange and tragic way, had become a mirror for the anxieties of modern life. By the end of 1919, the flood was no longer just a local disaster. It had become a national story, a touchstone in debates about labor, safety, and corporate responsibility. The question of blame was no longer confined to the North End. It was being asked in boardrooms, courtrooms, and newspapers across the country. The quest for justice began in the solemn chambers of the Suffolk County Superior Court, where the survivors of the flood and the families of the dead gathered with trembling hope. This would not be a swift or simple case. It was, in fact, the largest and most complex civil suit of its time in Massachusetts, a trial that would stretch across 6 years, with more than 1,000 witnesses called, thousands of pages of testimony recorded, and the lives of hundreds entangled in the pursuit of accountability. At the heart of the case stood the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, owner of the fateful tank. Against them stood more than 100 plaintiffs, injured survivors, widowed spouses, parents who had lost children, businesses ruined by the wave of molasses. Each carried not only a claim for damages, but also the weight of a community's moral outrage. The trial came to symbolize not just compensation, but the very principle of whether corporations could be held responsible when their pursuit of profit led to catastrophe. The proceedings began with testimony that painted a vivid picture of negligence. Residents of the North End recounted how the tank had leaked from the very beginning, how children would collect sticky drips in tin cups, and how workers had grown accustomed to the ominous groaning that echoed from the structure on hot days. One man described hearing rivets pop like gunshots in the weeks before the collapse. These testimonies formed a chorus of forewarning, a chorus the company had ignored. The defense, determined to escape liability, resurrected the claim of sabotage. In their telling, anarchists had targeted the tank in an act of political violence. This was not an outlandish idea in 1919. The nation had just weathered a wave of anarchist bombings, and Boston itself was a hotbed of labor unrest. Yet, the prosecution swiftly dismantled the argument. No traces of explosives had been found, no suspicious activity recorded, and the tank's long-standing structural flaws contradicted the notion of sudden external attack. Engineers played a decisive role in the trial. Experts presented diagrams of the tank, demonstrating how its steel walls were too thin to withstand the pressure of 2.3 million gallons of molasses. They revealed how the rivets had been of inferior quality and how the company had failed to test the tank with water before filling it with molasses, a basic safety precaution. Each technical detail struck like a hammer blow, eroding the defense's credibility. The conclusion grew ever clearer. The disaster was not sabotage, nor an act of God, but human negligence. The presiding auditor, Judge Hugh Ogden, listened with meticulous patience. A respected figure, Ogden took on the role of sifting through the endless testimony with a calm yet relentless eye for truth. Over the years, as the trial stretched into one of the longest of its kind, his role became almost that of historian as much as judge, assembling fragments of testimony, engineering reports, and personal grief into a coherent account of responsibility. The families of victims found themselves reliving their traumas in the courtroom. Widows spoke of husbands swallowed by the wave, parents of children drowned in the syrupy flood. Survivors described being pinned beneath debris, suffocating in molasses, or dragged from the mire half-dead. Each story, retold in the austere chamber, reminded all present that behind every legal claim lay flesh and blood lives torn apart. Lawyers for the company attempted to minimize responsibility, arguing that the tank had been built to industry standards of its day. They claimed that no reasonable engineer could have foreseen the catastrophe. But each time they spoke, the shadow of the tank loomed larger. The leaks, the stains, the groans, the ignored complaints. Public opinion outside the courtroom had already turned decisively against USIA, and the lawyers' arguments often rang hollow against the flood of testimony. The trial also revealed a striking divide between the powerful and the powerless. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, wealthy and far-reaching, fielded an army of attorneys. The plaintiffs, many of them poor immigrants from the North End, had little but their grief and the determination of local advocates. Yet in that courtroom, the imbalance of wealth and power was, for once, countered by the sheer weight of truth. Over time, the evidence piled up. The tank had been an accident waiting to happen, rushed into service without due diligence, poorly maintained, and ignored despite clear warnings. Judge Ogden, after years of patient inquiry, reached a conclusion that was damning in its clarity. The company bore full responsibility for the disaster. Negligence, not sabotage, had drowned Boston's North End in molasses. The ruling awarded more than $600,000 in damages, roughly equivalent to over $9 million today. Families of the dead received around $7,000 each, while survivors and businesses gained smaller sums. The compensation, though significant for its time, could never replace what had been lost. Lives, homes, and memories had been swept away in a wave of corporate neglect. Yet the legal victory carried meaning far beyond money. It represented a turning point in American law, a rare moment when a powerful corporation was held to account for failing in its duty of care to the public. The Great Molasses Flood trial set a precedent that reverberated through future cases, laying groundwork for modern principles of corporate liability and safety regulation. For the survivors, justice was bittersweet. The courtroom could affirm responsibility, but it could not restore the lives lost, nor cleanse the memory of sticky death and sorrow. Still, in the balance of history, the trial ensured that their suffering had not been in vain. It proved that the voices of ordinary people could prevail against wealth and power, that even in the face of absurd tragedy, the pursuit of justice could yield meaning. By the time the trial concluded in 1925, the flood had receded into memory for much of the nation. Yet for Boston, and especially for the North End, the legal battle had ensured that the disaster would not be dismissed as a freak accident. It had been investigated, argued, and judged for what it truly was, a preventable tragedy born of haste and greed. The conclusion of the Great Molasses Flood trial in 1925 did more than assign blame or distribute compensation. It altered the course of American law and industry. Out of sticky ruin and grief emerged a new awareness that industrial progress could not proceed without accountability, and that the safety of ordinary citizens had to be safeguarded through stricter regulation. The disaster had exposed the frailty of unchecked corporate power, and it left lawmakers, engineers, and city officials with an indelible lesson that neglect could kill as surely as any weapon. Boston was the first city to absorb this lesson. In the aftermath of the trial, building regulations were rewritten with a newfound emphasis on structural safety. Prior to the flood, there had been few requirements for independent engineering review of large tanks or industrial structures. A company could build as it pleased, relying on its own assessments, and often cutting corners to save time or cost. The molasses tank was emblematic of this reckless freedom, designed by someone with no formal engineering training, never pressure-tested, and filled to capacity in a dense neighborhood. After the flood, such laxity was no longer tolerated. Engineers were required to certify designs and oversee construction. Inspections became mandatory, and the state gained a greater hand in supervising projects whose failure could imperil the public. The flood also spurred conversation on corporate liability. Until then, companies often escaped accountability for disasters, blaming acts of God or pointing to workers' negligence. The ruling against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company established a critical precedent that corporations could be held responsible when their choices or lack of oversight directly endangered lives. In this way, the molasses flood became part of a broader shift in American jurisprudence, one that mirrored the country's gradual embrace of consumer protection and labor rights during the early 20th century. In the decades that followed, echoes of the flood could be traced in legislation. Industrial accidents were scrutinized more closely, and the principle of duty of care became embedded in safety laws. Though the federal government would not create OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, until 1970, the seeds of such oversight were planted in tragedies like the molasses flood. A direct line can be drawn between the sticky streets of the North End and the modern insistence that industrial structures be properly designed, tested, and inspected before being declared safe. For Boston itself, the changes were tangible. Construction permits became more rigorous. Large storage tanks were scrutinized not just for functionality, but for the risks they posed to surrounding communities. No longer would a company be allowed to plant an enormous vat of volatile material in the midst of homes and schools without oversight. The memory of January 15, 1919 ensured that residents demanded vigilance from their leaders. The flood also influenced the growing field of engineering ethics. At the time, engineering was still evolving into a recognized profession with codified standards. Many early engineers were self-taught or trained through apprenticeships, and professional societies had only just begun promoting standards of competence and responsibility. The molasses tank, designed without professional engineering input, demonstrated the cost of such laxity. Professional organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers used the disaster as a cautionary tale, pointing to the need for trained experts and ethical codes that placed public welfare above company profit. In this way, the disaster contributed not just to legal reforms, but to the very culture of engineering in the United States. The cultural memory of the flood also reinforced a broader societal shift, the recognition that progress carried risks that had to be managed, not ignored. The 19th century had celebrated industrial expansion almost uncritically, hailing factories, railroads, and new technologies as unalloyed goods. But the 20th century, scarred by disasters like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, the Halifax explosion of 1917, and the Boston Molasses Flood, learned to temper enthusiasm with caution. Industry could enrich, but it could also maim or kill. This duality demanded oversight, not blind trust. Even the insurance industry adapted. Companies that once insured industrial projects with minimal scrutiny began demanding higher safety standards before issuing policies. The molasses flood had shown insurers the potential costs of negligence on a massive scale. If a single tank could destroy a neighborhood, then prevention was far cheaper than paying claims after disaster. This shift in calculation further reinforced the push for inspections and independent engineering evaluations. And yet, for all the reforms that flowed from the sticky tide, there was also a reminder of human stubbornness. Even after the flood, some business leaders resisted stricter regulations, warning that too much oversight would stifle innovation and raise costs. The battle between safety and profit did not end in 1919, it merely entered a new phase. But the families of the North End and the citizens of Boston who had seen molasses drown their neighbors knew the truth that could no longer be denied. Human lives could not be collateral in the pursuit of industry. In classrooms of engineering schools, the Great Molasses Flood would later appear in case studies as one of the earliest examples of how negligence, haste, and disregard for safety can culminate in catastrophe. Students learned not only the technical failures, the thin steel walls, the inadequate rivets, but the ethical failures, the dismissal of community complaints, the arrogance of ignoring danger, the prioritization of cost over care. These lessons outlived the flood itself, ensuring that new generations would remember what Boston had endured. Thus, from a tragedy so strange it seemed almost absurd, the United States found itself nudged toward a more responsible future. It was a bitter way to learn such lessons, but history rarely grants gentle teachers. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 was not easily forgotten in Boston. Its absurdity, its tragedy, and its sheer strangeness lodged it into the collective imagination, a memory that lingered long after the last sticky residue was scrubbed from the cobblestones. For those who lived through it, the flood became a story retold at kitchen tables, in taverns, and on neighborhood stoops. For outsiders, it was a curiosity, a grotesque tale that seemed almost comical until one confronted the death toll and the devastation it left behind. Survivors carried the memory differently. To the children who had been in school that day, it was a moment of terror that became part of their identity, a story they would repeat well into old age. Some recalled the smell of molasses seeping into their classrooms, others the sight of neighbors swept off their feet by the wave. To families who lost loved ones, the flood was not merely an anecdote, but a source of grief woven into their personal histories. For decades, obituaries in Boston would sometimes note a connection to the flood, marking the deceased as a survivor or as kin to someone who had perished. The North End itself bore the mark of memory. Though the physical destruction was repaired within a year, residents claimed the smell of molasses lingered for decades. Oral histories describe hot summer days when the sun baked the cobblestones and a faint sweetness rose from the ground, as though the city itself refused to let the disaster fade. Whether the odor truly persisted so long, or whether memory sharpened the imagination, is impossible to know. But the belief itself became a kind of folklore, that the North End would forever smell faintly of sugar and sorrow. Boston newspapers, which had initially covered the flood with urgency and horror, soon transformed it into a symbol of resilience. Articles a year later framed the disaster as a tragedy overcome, a sign of the North End's toughness. Yet the sensational aspects of the story never disappeared. Reporters across the country seized on the oddity of death by molasses, and for decades after, the flood appeared in lists of unusual disasters, filed alongside tales of raining frogs or exploding flour mills. The strange combination of comedy and catastrophe shaped how the flood was remembered in the wider American imagination. On the one hand, people joked about it. Cartoons appeared in magazines, quipping about death by desert. On the other, the raw statistics: 21 dead, over 100 injured, entire buildings flattened, ensured that the story carried weight beyond humor. This duality gave the flood a mythic quality. It was both ridiculous and devastating, a reminder that life could be upended by forces as unexpected as a tank of syrup bursting in the sun. In Boston, anniversaries of the flood were quietly observed by the families most affected, though for many years there was no official commemoration. It was not until later in the 20th century, when historians began exploring industrial disasters and local memory, that the flood was reframed as a subject worthy of serious reflection. The Bostonian Society, historical journals, and eventually museums began to document the event, collecting survivor testimonies and photographs. In this way, the flood transitioned from neighborhood lore into recognized history. Folklore carried the story far beyond Boston. Writers embellished it, turning the wave of molasses into something almost biblical, a sticky tsunami swallowing streets. Some claimed that horses caught in the flood were preserved in syrup as though fossilized in amber, an exaggeration that blurred fact with legend. Others insisted the city's harbor remained brown for months, though records suggest the discoloration faded within weeks. Such stories, half true, half imagined, revealed how memory works. It exaggerates, it condenses, it reshapes until what remains is less an exact record than an enduring myth. The flood also inspired a certain moral memory. For reformers and advocates of safety, it became a parable about greed and negligence. For everyday Bostonians, it symbolized the vulnerability of ordinary life to forces beyond control. Parents told their children about it as a warning. Disasters are not always fire or storm. Sometimes they come from the things you trust, the containers built by human hands. As decades passed, the flood slipped into the background of Boston's history, overshadowed by larger tragedies and greater upheavals. Yet it never vanished completely. In the 1980s and 1990s, scholars revived interest in it, producing books and documentaries that reintroduced the flood to new generations. By the early 21st century, it had become a fixture in lists of strange but true history, recounted in classrooms, walking tours, and trivia nights. Today, in the North End, a small plaque marks the site of the disaster. Visitors pause before it, often surprised to learn of the tragedy, and locals share the story with pride or bemusement. For Boston's heritage, the flood has become part of its identity, proof that even the strangest disasters can shape a city's memory. Memory, after all, is not just what happened, but what we choose to preserve, what we retell until it becomes inseparable from who we are. And in Boston, sticky streets and the ghosts of 1919 remain part of the fabric of remembrance, woven into the city's sense of itself. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 has persisted not only as a local memory, but as a cultural symbol, rippling outward through literature, music, education, and even humor. What might have remained a tragic footnote in Boston's industrial history instead became a reference point in modern culture, both grim and whimsical, both a cautionary tale and an oddity. Its afterlife reveals how society chooses to remember catastrophe by reinterpreting it, reframing it, and reshaping it to meet new contexts. Writers were among the first to resurrect the flood for modern audiences. Throughout the mid-20th century, the event occasionally surfaced in history anthologies, often nestled among curiosities such as Krakatoa's eruption or the Chicago Fire. Yet as the century waned, scholars and journalists began to explore the flood more deeply. Stephen Pulleo's Dark Tide. The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, published in 2003, was perhaps the most significant of these retellings, weaving archival research with survivor testimony to create a definitive narrative. This book reintroduced the flood to a global audience, inspiring renewed interest in Boston's sticky disaster and cementing its place in the canon of industrial tragedies. Popular media quickly followed. Documentaries on PBS and the History Channel dramatized the event with grainy photographs, survivor interviews, and computer simulations of the wave of molasses surging through Boston's North End. The strange duality of comedy and catastrophe once again took center stage. Audiences chuckled at the absurdity of syrup destroying a city, yet gasped at the grim reality of crushed buildings and lost lives. This tension made the story memorable, a disaster that was at once hard to believe and impossible to ignore. The flood has even seeped into music and art. Folk singers and satirical bands have referenced it in songs, often as a metaphor for life's unpredictable cruelty. In local Boston artwork, murals and installations occasionally depict waves of dark syrup engulfing brick buildings, turning tragedy into visual metaphor. For some, the flood represents corporate greed unchecked. For others, it is simply a reminder of the fragility of urban life. Education, too, has kept the story alive. Teachers use the flood in history classrooms to illustrate the progressive era's struggles with industrial safety and corporate accountability. For science educators, the flood becomes a case study in fluid dynamics. The peculiar behavior of molasses, with its non-Newtonian viscosity, explains why the wave was both swift and deadly. Even law professors reference the case, citing the landmark class action lawsuit that followed as one of America's earliest examples of modern liability law. Through these lessons, the flood transforms from tragedy into tool, a way of teaching across disciplines. At the same time, the flood has maintained a place in humor. Comedians and writers for magazines like The New Yorker or The Onion occasionally reference death by molasses as a punchline. Trivia books relish the oddity of it, placing the disaster alongside tales of raining fish or exploding beer vats. This humorous framing may feel disrespectful, but it also ensures the story's survival. By becoming part of pop culture's collection of strange but true events, the flood reaches audiences who might otherwise never hear of it. Boston itself has embraced this strange duality. Walking tours in the North and frequently mention the flood, balancing solemnity with irony. Some restaurants and breweries in the city have even named drinks or desserts after the event, reclaiming the molasses as part of Boston's cultural identity rather than simply its nightmare. What was once tragedy has, in some ways, become kitsch. Yet this commodification is also a form of remembrance, ensuring that the flood remains part of the city's narrative. In literature and metaphor, the flood has served as a symbol of unchecked progress, greed, and the unintended consequences of industrial ambition. Writers comparing financial crises, political corruption, or environmental disasters sometimes invoke a flood of molasses to describe events that are both slow-moving and devastating, sweet on the surface but corrosive beneath. In this way, the story transcends its specifics, becoming a flexible metaphor for disaster itself. Yet amidst all this cultural reinterpretation, the human cost is never fully erased. Descendants of victims occasionally push back against overly humorous framings, reminding the public that 21 people died and families were scarred forever. For them, cultural retellings must balance entertainment with reverence. It is this balance between tragedy and absurdity that makes the Great Molasses Flood such a compelling part of modern culture. Ultimately, the flood's enduring presence reflects humanity's need to make sense of chaos. By weaving it into books, songs, lessons, and jokes, people transform the inexplicable into something they can grasp. A wave of syrup may seem surreal, but in its retelling it becomes a story of hubris, resilience, and the strange ways history lives on. The Great Molasses Flood did not simply end when the last puddles dried, nor when the last lawsuit closed. Its legacy reached beyond Boston's North End, spilling into courtrooms, legislatures, universities, and public consciousness. What began as a neighborhood tragedy became a turning point in how America confronted the relationship between industry, law, and society. The most immediate lesson was one of accountability. Before 1919, large corporations often acted with relative impunity. They were trusted to build, maintain, and manage infrastructure with little government oversight. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, owner of the ill-fated tank, assumed it could erect a massive structure without rigorous engineering reviews or city inspections. The flood proved otherwise. When 21 lives were lost and hundreds injured, the public demanded answers. The subsequent trial, the largest civil case in Massachusetts history at the time, set a precedent. For the first time, a corporation was held broadly accountable for negligence, forced to pay damages exceeding $600,000, equivalent to tens of millions today. This was not merely restitution. It was a signal that industry could no longer hide behind profit margins when public safety was compromised. The flood also accelerated reform in building codes and inspection protocols. Across Boston and beyond, municipalities began requiring professional engineering certification for large structures. Tanks, bridges, and factories were no longer left to the discretion of business owners alone. They required oversight, calculations, and regulatory approval. In this way, the victims' suffering helped usher in a safer urban future. It was an incremental step, but a critical one, in the long march toward modern building standards. Another legacy lay in the field of science. For physicists and engineers, the molasses flood became a rare real-world example of fluid dynamics on a catastrophic scale. Molasses, a non-Newtonian fluid, behaved unpredictably, rushing at an estimated 35 miles per hour in its initial wave, then thickening into an adhesive trap as temperatures dropped. This combination of speed and stickiness confounded rescuers and fascinated scientists. Decades later, graduate students and professors would still study the event, analyzing how a viscous material could mimic the destructive force of water while creating unique hazards. Thus, the flood remained a reference point not only in law and history, but also in physics. The cultural memory of the flood served another purpose. It became a warning against hubris. In the early 20th century, industry raced ahead with little regard for consequence. The rush to build the tank, to profit from wartime alcohol sales, and to cut corners in design reflected a mindset that growth outweighed caution. The molasses flood shattered that illusion. It reminded Americans that progress must be tempered with responsibility, that ambition without oversight can destroy as much as it creates. In this sense, the disaster belongs to a lineage of tragedies, from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 to more recent industrial accidents that shaped the nation's conscience. Boston itself absorbed the lessons with a mix of pride and humility. For decades, the city carried the memory quietly, its residents reluctant to relive the sticky nightmare. Yet over time, remembrance became ritual. Memorial plaques, walking tours, and public commemorations ensured that the victims were not forgotten. In classrooms, students learned not just about the absurdity of syrup drowning a city, but about the lives interrupted, the families changed, and the systemic reforms born from the tragedy. Boston's identity as a city of resilience was reinforced, its history enriched by the acknowledgement of both triumph and failure. The flood also became part of a broader dialogue about how societies respond to disaster. When calamities strike, be they natural, industrial, or human-made, the choice lies in whether to bury the memory or to learn from it. The molasses flood stands as an example of the latter. By studying the causes, demanding accountability, and enacting reform, Boston transformed a senseless tragedy into a catalyst for change. Even today, echoes of the flood surface in unexpected ways. In discussions of urban planning, corporate regulation, and industrial safety, scholars cite the 1919 disaster as a cautionary tale. In the cultural imagination, the image of a syrupy wave remains strangely enduring, both surreal and sobering. For some, it symbolizes the absurdity of history. For others, It is a reminder of how fragile human life is when institutions fail. Ultimately, the lessons carried forward from the Great Molasses Flood extend beyond tanks and city streets. They touch upon the timeless truth that progress is only meaningful when it safeguards the human beings it is meant to serve. The sticky tide of 1919 destroyed homes, lives, and livelihoods, but in its wake it left a legacy of reform, accountability, and remembrance. It forced a city, and in some ways a nation, to pause and reflect on what safety, justice, and responsibility truly mean. In the end, the Great Molasses Flood was more than an accident. It was a mirror, one that reflected the cost of unchecked ambition and the resilience of those who endured it. And though a century has passed, its lessons remain as relevant today as they were on that cold January afternoon. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is one of those stories that at first seems too strange to be true. A city neighborhood drowned not by fire, not by water, not by bombs or storms, but by a wave of syrup. Its absurdity makes it memorable. Its tragedy makes it unforgettable. What began as a burst tank became a defining event, a moment where Boston, and by extension America, was forced to reconcile the collision of industrial ambition, human negligence, and the fragility of life. The lesson it leaves us is not about molasses alone. Rather, it is about the unseen risks embedded in progress, about how the infrastructures we trust, tanks, bridges, pipelines, skyscrapers, can betray us if built without care or oversight. The flood is a testament to the arrogance of assuming that speed and profit can outrun responsibility. And yet, it is also a testament to the resilience of people, for even amid destruction, survivors rebuilt their homes, demanded justice, and in doing so created safer standards for generations that followed. A century later, the echoes of the flood still ripple outward. Each time a building collapses due to corner cutting, each time a community is poisoned by industrial waste, each time corporate negligence endangers the public, the same questions resurface. Who is accountable? How much risk is acceptable in the pursuit of gain? And how can society ensure that tragedy leads not to repetition, but to reform? The Molasses Flood reminds us that history is not simply a sequence of dates and disasters. It is a reservoir of warnings. Philosophically, the event also speaks to the fragility of order. One moment, children played in the street, horses hauled carts, workers went about their daily tasks. The next, an unstoppable tide transformed familiarity into chaos. It reminds us of the unpredictability of life, of how quickly normalcy can dissolve. In this sense, the flood belongs to the universal human story of how people confront disaster, with shock, with grief, but ultimately with adaptation. The memorials that now stand in Boston do not merely recall a bizarre accident. They embody a pledge that memory itself is a form of justice. To remember is to honor the lives lost, to give meaning to their suffering by ensuring the mistakes that caused it are not repeated. In a way, the sticky residue left on the streets a century ago has never fully been washed away. It lingers in collective consciousness as a caution, as a story retold to children and students, as a symbol of both folly and resilience. In the present day, when cities swell larger and technologies grow ever more complex, the Great Molasses Flood serves as a gentle but persistent whisper. Safety must never be sacrificed at the altar of haste or profit. Its absurdity makes us laugh. Its human cost makes us pause. And perhaps that is why it endures, because in its strange blend of comedy and tragedy, it reflects the essence of human history itself. Capable of great achievement, vulnerable to great error, yet always striving to learn, to adapt, to endure. In the end, the flood was not only about molasses. It was about us, our choices, our systems, our responsibilities. And though the syrup has long since seeped into the earth, the story remains, sticky in memory, binding past to present, reminding us that progress without caution is as dangerous as any wave, whether of water, fire, or sugar.